There comes a moment in a man's life when he realizes that the person he has been running from is the only person he must finally confront. It doesn't happen in a moment of victory or celebration. It happens in the quietest hours, when the world feels distant and the weight of his own reflection becomes impossible to ignore. A man stops running from himself, not because he suddenly feels brave, but because hiding has become too heavy. Pretending has become too exhausting. Avoidance has become too costly. And the voice inside him, the one he has silenced for years, finally becomes louder than all the noise he used to distract himself with. For years, you may have filled your days with movement. Movement that looked productive, movement that looked responsible, movement that looked like growth, but deep down, you knew the truth. Most of that movement was just running. Running from discipline, running from accountability, running from the wounds you refused to clean. Running from the identity you feared you might not be able to live up to. Running from the man you secretly knew you were born to become. And the brutal irony is that the faster you ran, the more lost you felt. Because running from yourself is the longest journey a man can take. But something happens when the running finally stops. Something ancient stirs. Something raw awakens. You begin to feel the quiet truth rising inside you, the truth that no monster has ever chased you harder than your own potential. You weren't running from failure. You were running from responsibility. You weren't running from weakness. You were running from the strength you knew you would have to earn. You weren't running from fear. You were running from the discipline that fear demands. When you finally stop running, you are forced to face the reality of who you've been and who you must become. And it is in that confrontation, raw, uncomfortable, unfiltered, that a man's life begins to change. Not gradually, not subtly, but with a force that feels like a spiritual collision. Because every mile you once ran away from yourself now becomes a mile you walk back with intention. And this time, you walk with your eyes open. This moment, this awakening, often begins in silence. A silence that doesn't soothe you but exposes you. The silence of mornings, where you wake up and feel the emptiness of your own excuses. The silence of nights, where your thoughts hit harder than any criticism ever could. The silence of realizing that the life you want demands the death of the man you have been pretending to be. And that silence is not your enemy, it is your summons. A man who stops running from himself starts to see his habits for what they are, gateways or prisons. Discipline becomes a mirror, not a punishment. Responsibility becomes strength, not burden. Honesty becomes liberation, not shame. He understands that every lie he told himself was just another layer of the cage he built around his own potential. And breaking that cage requires courage, not the loud kind, but the steady kind. The kind that shows up when no one is watching. The kind that takes responsibility without needing applause. And make no mistake, stopping the run is not comfortable. It forces you to stand in front of the version of yourself you abandoned, the version that dreamed bigger, the version that believed deeper, the version that wasn't yet broken by compromise. You meet him again, and he asks you questions you can no longer avoid. Why did you stop? Why did you settle? Why did you hide? Why did you let fear shape your destiny instead of discipline? Most men never answer these questions. They die with them. They spend life running in circles, confusing motion with direction. But the man who chooses to stop, who chooses to face himself, discovers something life-changing. The enemy was never failure. The enemy was fragmentation. The split between who you are and who you know you could be. Closing that gap is what creates power. Closing that gap is what builds identity. Closing that gap is what makes a man unstoppable. When you finally stop running, you begin reclaiming the parts of yourself you abandoned along the way. Your ambition, your hunger, your integrity, your standards, your purpose. You begin building a new foundation, not based on fear, but on alignment. You make decisions not to escape pain, but to honor your potential. You stop numbing yourself with distractions and start nourishing yourself with discipline. You stop chasing comfort and start chasing capability. And slowly, you begin to feel something you haven't felt in years: self-respect. Self-respect is the currency of powerful men. It is earned, not given. And nothing earns it faster than telling yourself the truth and acting on it. When you keep your promises to yourself, even small ones, you expand. When you stay consistent, even quietly, you expand. When you stop betraying your potential for short-term relief, you expand. And eventually, you reach a point where running becomes impossible, not because you are trapped, but because you are awake. Awake to your purpose, awake to your responsibility, awake to your strength, awake to the man you are becoming. And in this awakening, the world begins to respond differently to you. People sense your stillness. They feel your discipline. They notice your direction. They recognize your presence. Not because you are trying to impress them, but because you have finally stopped abandoning yourself. A man who stands with himself never needs validation. His existence becomes his statement. This is the moment you stop running, not because you are tired, but because you are ready to rebuild, ready to rise, ready to meet the version of yourself you have feared, avoided, and underestimated for far too long. And once you take that first step, fully conscious, fully committed, there is no going back, because a man who stops running from himself becomes a man the world cannot run from. There comes a moment in a man's evolution when the weight he's been carrying stops feeling like a curse and starts revealing itself as preparation. A moment when the silence around him stops sounding like abandonment and starts sounding like the space required for transformation. This is the phase where a man begins to understand that everything he interpreted as rejection was actually redirection. Everything that felt like punishment was shaping. Everything that felt like loss was the making of the man he needed to become. At first, it doesn't feel like awakening, it feels like breaking. The world grows colder. People grow distant. The support you expected never arrives. The encouragement you waited for never comes. You look around and realize that the hands you once reached for are no longer there, and the ones that are still around no longer feel as close. Life becomes quieter, heavier, more honest, almost painfully honest. But inside that honesty, inside that raw and unfiltered reality, a new type of strength begins to form. Not the loud strength men pretend to have, the real kind, the kind forged in long nights, in heavy mornings, in silent battles no one applauds. A man only becomes who he was meant to be when life strips away everything he was using as a crutch. When the applause stops, when the validation disappears, when the world stops cheering, that's where real identity begins. Because a man who builds himself in silence becomes unshakable. He learns to operate without permission. He learns to move without approval. He learns to rise without witnesses. And that level of self-reliance rewires the way he walks into every room. You can always tell when a man reaches this stage. His presence shifts, his energy becomes heavier, steadier, sharper. Not because he's trying to be intimidating, but because he's no longer trying to be understood. He stops explaining himself. He stops overthinking his decisions. He stops apologizing for wanting more. He stops shrinking his potential to fit into rooms that were too small for him from the beginning. This is the turning point where a man transforms from someone waiting to be chosen into someone who chooses himself. And that shift is dangerous, in the best way possible. Men who stop waiting become forces of nature. They move differently. They think differently. They carry themselves with an authority that doesn't need to announce itself. They no longer look around to see who's watching. They no longer fear being underestimated. They no longer chase acknowledgement because they finally understand something most people spend a lifetime avoiding. Your life changes the moment you stop needing the world to care. This is where masculine resilience is born, not in comfort, not in applause, in the loneliness that reveals your true foundation, in the silence that forces you to confront who you are without the noise, in the struggles that demand you grow instead of complain. Pain becomes the tutor you didn't ask for but desperately needed. Rejection becomes the direction you couldn't see before. Hardship becomes the sharpening stone that makes you precise, patient, unstoppable. And the transformation doesn't happen all at once. It's subtle, it's quiet. It's the way you stop reacting emotionally to things that used to trigger you. It's the way you start breathing before you speak. It's the way you walk away instead of explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. It's the way you begin valuing peace over approval, growth over comfort, purpose over pleasure. That's the rise of a man reclaiming himself. The Stoics taught that a man's power is rooted in the mastery of his inner world. When you understand this, something profound happens. Life stops controlling you. People stop manipulating you. Opinions stop defining you. Your mind becomes your ally instead of your tormentor. You develop an internal stillness that cannot be shaken by the chaos outside you. And this stillness becomes your competitive advantage in a world addicted to noise. But the biggest shift happens internally, where no one can see it. You begin to trust yourself, not because everything is perfect, but because you've survived things that should have destroyed you. You begin to respect yourself, not because of achievements, but because you kept going when everything in you wanted to quit. You begin to value your own voice more than the opinions thrown at you from people who don't carry your weight, walk your path, or fight your battles. This is where true confidence is born, not the fake confidence built on pretending, the real kind built on enduring. A man who has faced himself becomes a man who cannot be broken by the world. And here's the part most people don't understand. The moment you stop depending on external validation, you become magnetic. People feel your shift. They sense the groundedness in your silence, the authority in your calm, the depth in your presence. You don't chase respect, it arrives. You don't chase recognition, it follows. You don't chase admiration, it gravitates to you naturally because you embody the very thing men spend their lives trying to imitate. This is why resilience is the birthplace of masculine power. Not the power to dominate others, but the power to dominate yourself. The power to rise when nothing supports you. The power to act when no one believes in you. The power to carry your own weight with dignity, discipline, and direction. And once a man learns to stand alone, he becomes untouchable. Not because he is hard, but because he is whole. Not because he is cold, but because he is complete. Not because he rejects the world, but because he's no longer controlled by it. When you reach this stage, life opens in ways you never imagined. Doors appear where you once saw walls. Opportunities arise where you once saw obstacles. Strength flows where you once felt weakness. Because the moment a man stops waiting for someone to save him, he becomes the man capable of saving himself. There comes a point in a man's awakening where the shift inside him becomes irreversible. The old version of him, the one that begged for attention, chased validation, feared silence, starts fading like a shadow at sunrise. What rises in its place is something heavier, something clearer, something far more dangerous to the weakness he once carried. A man who has survived himself becomes a man who cannot be broken by anything outside him. And in this final phase of his transformation, he begins to embody a truth few ever reach. Strength is not built in the moments when everything is working. Strength is built in the moments when nothing is. This is when he realizes that life was never withholding blessings out of cruelty. It was waiting for him to become the version of himself capable of holding them. The universe doesn't give power to men who haven't built the discipline to sustain it. It doesn't give responsibility to men who crumble under pressure. It doesn't give leadership to men who still need applause to move forward. So life takes everything away that makes you weak until only the unbreakable part of you remains. And when a man reaches that stage, something profound happens inside him. He no longer sees pain as something unfair. He sees it as something useful. He no longer sees abandonment as betrayal. He sees it as clarity. He no longer sees silence as punishment. He sees it as training. Everything that once looked like destruction now looks like construction. Everything that once felt like loss now feels like refinement. Everything that once terrified him now fuels him. This is the moment a man begins to understand why the world went quiet, why people drifted away, why life felt harder, why the weight got heavier. Because strength is not built through ease. Strength is built through exposure. Exposure to pressure, exposure to uncertainty, exposure to solitude, exposure to the parts of yourself you didn't want to confront. And when you stop resisting that exposure, when you let it carve you, your identity shifts from reactive to rooted. A rooted man moves through the world differently. He no longer panics in the face of chaos. He no longer collapses when life becomes unpredictable. He no longer seeks comfort in people who can't even comfort themselves. His calm becomes a weapon. His discipline becomes a shield. His silence becomes a statement. And his presence becomes something that others feel before he even speaks. This is what the Stoics meant when they spoke of becoming immovable. Not physically, but internally. Becoming the type of man who stands steady while the world around him shakes. The type of man who doesn't need reassurance because he has built his own certainty. The type of man who doesn't wait for the world to soften because he has learned to harden the parts of himself that needed to grow. When you reach this level of masculinity, your relationship with life changes. You stop looking for shortcuts. You stop begging for easy paths. You stop waiting for someone to notice your effort. Instead, you begin to appreciate the grind itself. You begin to appreciate the weight because it keeps you sharp. You begin to appreciate the silence because it keeps you focused. You begin to appreciate the solitude because it keeps you honest. Most men never reach this point. They spend their entire lives searching for someone to save them emotionally, financially, spiritually. They wait for the right moment, the right praise, the right opportunity. They build their identity on external approval and wonder why everything collapses when that approval disappears. But the man who masters himself, who stops waiting for the world to rescue him, steps into a life where he no longer needs the world to behave a certain way for him to move forward. He becomes internally governed, not externally triggered. He becomes emotionally disciplined, not emotionally reactive. He becomes grounded, not dependent. And once a man reaches that level, freedom enters his life in ways he could never access before. Not the freedom to do whatever he wants, but the freedom to not be controlled by everything he fears. This is where his purpose sharpens, his decisions sharpen, his standards sharpen. He no longer entertains people who drain him. He no longer explains himself to people who don't listen. He no longer negotiates with his weaknesses or bargains with his potential. A man who has awakened cannot return to the man he was. His mind won't allow it. His spirit won't allow it. And his future won't allow it, because once you've seen yourself rise without help, you realize you never needed it. Once you've seen yourself survive what should have broken you, you begin to trust your own strength. Once you've seen yourself walk through life without applause, you stop caring about who's watching. That is the power of a man who rebuilds himself. He becomes a force shaped by pressure, not defined by it. And here is the shift that completes his transformation. He stops living from emotion and starts living from principle. Principles become his compass. Discipline becomes his engine. Responsibility becomes his anchor. Vision becomes his fuel. And growth becomes his default setting. He rises not because life gets easier, but because he finally understands that he was built for difficulty. And with that understanding comes a new type of calm, the calm of a man who knows he can carry his own world without collapsing, the calm of a man who knows that storms don't destroy him, they reveal him, the calm of a man who no longer needs saving because he has become the type of man who saves himself. And now, with this awareness burning inside him, he looks at his life through a new lens. The struggles of his past become stories of initiation. The betrayals become lessons in self-respect. The loneliness becomes the birthplace of strength. Everything he once avoided becomes the exact thing he needed to face. Because nothing molds a man more deeply than the moments he had to rely solely on himself. This is the final realization every awakened man reaches. No one is coming, and that's the best thing that ever happened to you. Because the moment you stop waiting for someone to carry you, you learn to build the legs to walk through fire. The moment you stop waiting for someone to choose you, you learn to choose yourself with conviction. The moment you stop waiting for someone to believe in you, you develop a certainty that cannot be taken away. And a man who believes in himself becomes dangerous, not to others, but to the weakness he's leaving behind. This is your awakening. This is your turning point. This is the moment you stop needing and start becoming. And once you become the man who saves himself, you never go back.